I play 3-5 cash at South Point Casino in Las Vegas, Nevada. I face many annoying spots versus a tight old man and lose big to start, but end up getting revenge in the best way possible. What's up everyone? Quick announcement before we get into the hands. I have finally launched my own merch. This is poker themed clothing for poker fans that you will actually want to wear. Designs like this one that say clock, or this one that says I'm probably bluffing, because I am, and more. Click the link below and go to duvalin.com to check out all of the designs. Any purchase will help support my path to poker and content full time. Act fast, as the first 23 orders will be entered to win a 1% free roll to my 2023 $10,000 WSOP main event. If you can't afford a t-shirt at this time, no worries. I really appreciate everyone who watches in general. Now let's get into the hands. In the first hand of the night, I have Ace 7 of Hearts, and there is an under the gun limp for $5. We raise to $25 in the cutoff. Just the under the gun limper makes the call, and the flop comes Queen 7-5, 1 heart. Oddly enough, the under the gun player leads for $25 or half pot. With middle pair, 1 over, and a backdoor flush draw, I'm going nowhere. I make the call. The turn comes to 3 of clubs. This time, my opponent bets $60 into about 100. We could fold here, but I end up calling again and seeing what happens on the river. The river is good, the ace of diamonds. This time, my opponent slows down and checks. If they have a queen, I definitely want to get value, so I bet a size that is not too big that I think my opponent will call, $100. Unfortunately, my opponent ends up folding, and my guess is they didn't even have a queen. I have another suited ace in this next hand, ace 5 of diamonds. I raise under the gun 1 to $15, and the button and big blind make the call. The flop comes ace 9-7, 2 clubs. Having top pair here is great, but having such a weak kicker is not. For this reason, when the big blind checks, I also check, and the button ends up betting $30. The big blind calls, and at this point, I don't really think my hand's good that often. I could get behind a fold here, but I do end up making the call. The turn is quite helpful for us as it comes a 5 of clubs. I now have 2 pair, but there is now a possibility for someone to have a flush. This time, action ends up checking through. The river comes a 3 of spades. This time, the big blind leads for $100. When the button does not bet the turn, we can pretty much guarantee they do not have a flush. The big blind, on the other hand, certainly could. With this said, we do still have 2 pair, which is a very strong hand, so we end up calling. The button folds, and the big blind shows a bluff, 10-8 off, for a missed open-ended straight draw on the flop. We are not done with the suited aces quite yet. This time we have a real one, ace queen of spades. The under the gun 1 player limps $5. I raise to $25 in the low jack. The button and limper make the call. The flop comes queen jack deuce, 2 hearts. Action checks to me, and with top pair top kicker, I'm going to bet. I make it $50. Just the under the gun 1 limper makes the call. The turn comes the jack of diamonds. When my opponent checks, I certainly could check back as they do have some jack X. But I think because this specific player is an old man coffee type, he most likely just has a worse queen or a flush draw. For this reason, I do decide to continue and bet 135 into about 175. My opponent just makes a call, and the river comes the 8 of spades. This time, with almost $500 in the pot, my opponent leads for $200. They are only leaving about $200 left behind in their stack. This is super annoying, but I'm never folding my hand for this price. I make the call. They do end up showing jack 9 of spades. They turned trips, and it turns out they play a lot looser than I thought. More from them in this next hand as I have pocket 6s. The old man limps under the gun, and I raise to $25 under the gun 1. The small blind calls and the limper calls. The flop comes queen 6 deuce. We flop middle set. Action checks to us, and similar to last hand, I bet $50. Also similar, just the under the gun old man limper makes the call. We are setting up a big pot for payback, and the turn comes to 3 of diamonds. My opponent checks, and although the flush does get there, I think having a set here is just too strong to check back when my opponent can still have a queen. I bet 130 into 175. This hand is finally different from last hand, as my opponent will raise this time to 260. He is saying he has a flush, which beats my set, but I can't fold quite yet. I make the call. The river comes the ace of diamonds. This only makes things even worse. Now any diamond beats me. My opponent bets 150, which is about half of my remaining stack. This is such a small price compared to the size of the pot, but it's not like this guy is capable of bluffing. So despite the price, I make the fold. This old man coffee once again owns me in a large pot. Next up, I have pocket queens, and there is an under the gun straddle on for $10. The low jack raises to $50. The cutoff cutoff and button call. Being that I only have about $500 or 50 big blinds with the straddle on to start this hand, I think I only have one move, and that is all in. Action folds back around to the under the gun straddle, who goes all in as well over top. This is for far more money, like $2,000 plus. So I'm not feeling great. The original raiser and callers end up folding, and the flop comes king 4-3. The turn is an 8 and the river is a 5. My opponent ends up showing pocket aces. What went from a pretty great spot to have queens quickly turned into a very unlucky spot, as my opponent had aces in the straddle. Time to rebuy. In the next hand, I have king queen off, and there's an under the gun 1 raised to $20. The small blind calls and I complete in the big blind. The flop comes king 5 deuce. Action checks to the opener, who bets $35. The small blind folds, and with top pair we make the call. The turn comes to 10 of hearts. I check, and this time my opponent bets $75. Once again, with top pair and second to best kicker, we make the call. The river comes to 9 of diamonds. I check, and my opponent puts in a third and final barrel for $150. While we will be beat here sometimes, this is only a slightly over half pot size bet. We make the call, and my opponent ends up showing 10-9 off. That's right, he turned a 10 and rivered 2 pair. He really shouldn't have even bet the turn. What's he getting to call other than better? Then gets immediately rewarded. This hand was super tilting. Things are not going great. Let's turn it around in this next hand, as I have ace 9 of hearts. There is an early position limp and a hijack limp for $5. We raise to $30 on the cutoff. The big blind and all of the limpers call. The flop comes king queen 5, all hearts. We flop the nuts. Please, let's get some value. Everyone checks over to me, and I bet $40. We get 2 calls from the under the gun 1 and hijack. The turn comes to 10 of diamonds. Action checks to us once again, and this time I bet $75. I don't think we really get to go big here at all, considering the king and queen of hearts are out there. Just the hijack makes a call this time, and the river comes to 8 of hearts. This was not a card we wanted to see. It is now going to be even harder to get called. When my opponent checks, I put out the same bet of $75. Very, very small. I hope to get a crying call or induce a raise. This does not happen though, as my opponent ends up folding. This next hand is very exciting, as I have pocket kings, but more importantly, we are versus the old man Coffee that we lost lots to earlier. In unusual fashion, he starts off by raising under the gun to $15. We 3-bet to $50 under the gun too. Action folds back around to him, and he makes a call. The flop comes 6-4 deuce. This is the perfect flop for us. My opponent checks, and considering they don't usually raise pre, I'm thinking they have a very strong hand. A hand like an overpair that is worse than mine. For this reason, I think they will call a large bet, so I make it $80. They do in fact call, and the turn comes to 4 of spades. This is another great card, as my opponent is less likely to have a set like pocket fours. They check once again, and this time I bet $220 into about $260. They call, which we love to see, and the river comes to 10 of diamonds. With about $700 in the pot, my opponent leads all in for about $300. At this point, based off of what has happened in our previous hands, I'm thinking my opponent might have pocket 10s, or maybe even aces. But I'm never folding kings. I quickly make the call, and my opponent shows pocket jacks. I finally beat this old man in a large $1,300 plus pot. Revenge at last. Things are clearly starting to turn around for me after this hand, especially as I am the final winner of the $250 random seat giveaway of the night. I was legitimately staring at this screen as all of the names rolled by, thinking of my name popping up. I willed this bonus into existence, and I can't believe it. Let's put this big bonus to use as I pick up pocket jacks in this next hand and raise to $15 under the gun 1. The small blind 3-bets to $50, and we make the call. The flop comes king 6-5. My opponent c-bets for the same price, half pot, $50. I'm never folding here. I make the call, and the turn comes a 9 of clubs. This time my opponent checks. I don't really see much reason to bet here. I check back. The river is the 9 of spades. This time my opponent bets $175 into about $200. Having jacks here is okay, and I think I can call sometimes, but I think most of the time we're just going to be beat. The bet check bet line is very strong. My opponent also has less bluffs, as I have a club, so they are less likely to have a missed flush draw, so I do in fact end up folding. In the next hand I have ace 8 of diamonds, and we are short-handed with 6 players at the table. I raise the cutoff to $15, and the small blind makes a call. The flop comes queen 6-3, 2 diamonds. My opponent checks to me, and with the nut flush draw I go ahead and bet $20 into about $30, and my opponent makes a call. The turn is a 6 of clubs. This time when my opponent checks, I decide to check back. If they're calling in the small blind, they can certainly have some 6x type hands. The river comes a 7 of diamonds. We now have the nut flush. Interestingly enough, my opponent leads for $40. My opponent is very unlikely to have a boat as they did not check raise the flop, so I think it's safe to say we should have the best hand here. We go big and raise to 225. We want to get a 6 or a worse flush to make the call. After tanking for quite some time, my opponent ends up calling. We show and of course win an over $500 pot. My opponent will show ace 6 of hearts for the turned trips. We are very happy we checked back the turn in this one. Next up, I have pocket kings once again, and there is an under the gun limp for $5. The low jack raises to $15 and the cutoff calls. I'm in the small blind and I make it $80. Action folds back around to the low jack, who ends up calling. This player is very short to start, about $300 effective. The flop comes jack 10 9 2 spades. With basically a 1 stack to pot ratio, I am just going to go all in. I jam for what ends up being 192 as my opponent will make the call. The turn comes a 4 of hearts and the river is the 8 of hearts. We show and end up being good until the river, as my opponent shows pocket 7s. He must have put me on ace king, what can he say? Let's go for revenge in this next hand as we are up against the same player who just cracked our kings. That player limps on the hijack and the small blind calls. I check in the big blind with 8-4 off. The flop comes 8-5-4. We flop 2 pair. The small blind checks, I check, hoping the hijack bets, but unfortunately they check back. The turn comes the jack of diamonds. This time when the small blind checks, I decide to bet $25 into about 15. Just the hijack makes a call and the river comes the 9 of clubs. I think my 2 pair should definitely be good here most of the time. So I put in another big bet, maybe a greedy bet, but for someone who likes to call, I think it's fine. I bet $100. This size often makes my hand look like a bluff as well. To my surprise, my opponent min raises me to $200. After thinking it over for some time, I just don't see a possible hand they are bluffing for this size. They are just going to turn over queen 10 here and that's it. I make the fold and they win once again. Next up, I have pocket aces and there's an under the gun raise to $15. We 3-bet to $55 under the gun 1 and the under the gun 2 player cold calls. Action folds back around to the under the gun player who folds. The flop comes 9-7-5 rainbow. I think when my opponent cold calls pre, they are going to have pocket pairs. Who knows how small exactly, but pocket 7s through queens is definitely possible. For this reason, I think it's good to bet big here as we get max value from those overpairs. I bet $85 and my opponent goes all in for $600. This is really not a great spot. As I said, my opponent could certainly have pocket 7s or pocket 9s for a set. But would they really just jam so big with these hands? Maybe, maybe not, but I think overall when my opponent can still have overpairs, we have to just call here. I finally toss in some blacks and let's see a run out. The turn comes a 6 of spades and the river is an 8 of diamonds. This means there is a straight on board and any 10 beats me, so I am not loving this. I get especially annoyed when my opponent turns over pocket jacks. They did end up having a smaller overpair and we somehow did not double up as the board ran out a chop. I guess we can say we are glad that my aces weren't cracked, but this is basically the second worst thing to happen. In the next hand, we have pocket 8s and the hijack limps for $5. We raise to $30 in the small blind. Action folds back around to the hijack who back raises to $105. This player is only about $300 effective. I should really just fold here as the best case scenario is my opponent has ace king and we're flipping. Otherwise, I'm just going to be dominated. With that said, I'm getting an okay price and I feel like playing. I make the call. The flop comes queen 9 deuce rainbow. I check and my opponent checks back. The turn comes the 7 of spades. I check again and this time my opponent bets $100. For half pot, I end up making the call. The river comes a 10 of hearts. I check and my opponent puts in his remaining $109. With over $400 in the pot, I can't get away at this price. I make the call and my opponent shows pocket queens for top set. Admittedly, I just played this hand pretty poorly. I should have really just folded pre-flop. People never back raise without the nuts. Next up, I have ace queen off and we raise to $15 under the gun. The low jack makes a call on the button, 3-bets to $75. Typically, being on a position, this would just be a fold in a tough game, but this game was not too tough. So I decided to make the call and the low jack folds. The flop comes queen 10 10. This is a pretty good flop for us with top pair, top kicker. I start off with a check and my opponent checks back. The turn comes a 10 of spades. We now have a boat and things are looking good. When my opponent 3-bets pre, I suspect they have a strong strong hand here like pocket jacks or ace king. So for this reason, I think it's good to go for a big size. I bet 120 into about 165. My opponent makes a call and the river comes a 5 of spades. This is a good run out. With $405 in the pot, I'm gonna go for value. I make it $400. My opponent thinks it over, but eventually calls. We show and are good and scoop an over $1,200 pot. Next up, I have ace king off and the under the gun player raises to $15. We 3-bet under the gun 2 to $50. The big blind cold calls and the under the gun player also calls. The flop comes 10, 6, 5 rainbow. With 155 in the pot, action checks to me. We could check back, but I could definitely just bet here and get to barrel a lot of good turn cards. So I make it $60, but both the big blind and under the gun player make the call. The turn comes a 9 of spades. This is not one of those good turn cards. So when action checks to me, I happily check back. The river comes a 4 of spades. This time the under the gun player bets 125. With ace high and a player left to act behind me, I happily fold. In the next hand, I have ace deuce of diamonds and raise to $15 in the low jack. The hijack, button, and big blind all make the call. The flop comes 9, 8, 5, 2 diamonds. We flop the nut flush draw in a multi-way pot. I start off by checking to the hijack who bets $85. This is a large overbet from the same player who got lucky with the jacks versus our aces. Every other player folds and we make the call. The turn is the ace of hearts. We now have top pair to go along with our nut flush draw. I check once again and my opponent bets the same amount once again. $85, so this time pretty small into 230. I considered check raising here, but I just call. The river comes the ace of spades. My top pair has now improved to trips. I think we should definitely have the best hand at this point. If my opponent had a very strong hand, they would probably bet the turn much bigger. I decide to take an unconventional line and I lead for $200, which is about half pot. My opponent has about $600 behind at this point, and I really do not want to see them jam. Thankfully, they just make the call, we turn our hand over and are good. I'm guessing we got called by a middling pair, something like a 9. Happy to finally win a decent pot versus this opponent. In one of the last hands of the night, I have king queen off and raised to $15 in the low jack. The button and small blind and big blind all make the call. The flop comes queen, jack, 4. Being 6-handed especially, this is a very good flop for me. I bet $40 into 60. Just the big blind makes a call and the turn comes the deuce of spades. My opponent checks and I once again bet $100 into 140 this time. My opponent in the big blind calls once again and the river comes the 3 of clubs. They check to us, and although this may seem a bit light, I think we can certainly still go for value here. I bet $250 into about $340. My opponent thinks it over for a while and makes a call. We show and are good. My opponent will later say he needed to keep me honest and shows a queen. I may often value own myself in this spot versus something like ace queen, but versus this opponent, I thought he could certainly have a worse queen, which as we saw, he did. In the last hand of the night, we have ace queen off and the under the gun player limps for $5. We raise under the gun 1 to $30. The big blind calls and the under the gun player back raises to $100. We should definitely just be folding here a lot, but versus this specific player, I think a call is completely fine. I call and the big blind also calls. We go 3 ways to a flop that comes ace, 8, 5, all diamonds. The big blind only has about $300 in his stack and decides to actually open jam. He puts it all in for $288 exactly, and the under the gun player who back raised pre goes deep into the tank with lots of speech play, which I don't know how to interpret like this.
I'm gambling. I know you got the beat.
I can't tell if this is the biggest act of all time or you're being authentic.
With top pair, I do end up putting the under the gun player all in for about 150 more. They call and let's see a run out. The turn comes a 10 of hearts and the river is a 5 of spades. The big blind who open jammed on the flop decides to open fold, which leaves the under the gun player who shows pocket queens with a diamond. Turns out they were not angling of any kind and were not trying to get me to call. They really just didn't know if they should call or not.
I should have folded. God dang it.
Hands like this are why we play ace queen off pre, despite knowing we should probably fold most of the time. With this, we win about a $1,200 pot and are finally out for the night. I take one last look at this beautiful stack and empty room and cash out. Alright, ladies and gents, we started this video off during the day. It is now 4 a.m. Very long session, as you saw. Ran very poorly in the beginning of the session. So many suckouts, so many bad beats. And then we clawed our way back with the help of some drunk table mates that came very late in the night. And man, we bought in for
2,100 total, cashed out for something like 34.10. So about a $1,300 profit, which is very nice considering I didn't think I was going to profit at all. And there were so many moments in tonight's session where I was just so on tilt, but luckily managed to keep cool and come back. If you guys enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know what you thought. Thanks for watching. Peace.